4 decades after the fall of Saigon, has Vietnam become Washington's new best friend forever in Asia? Yes, on day 2 of his visit, Barack Obama brought up human rights. He called for openness in meetings with entrepreneurs in Ho Chi Minh City. But the U.S. president also announcing the end of an arms embargo on this trip, an arms embargo that had been in place since the Vietnam War, and also talking up the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TTIP, which both sides strongly favor. In both cases, we're talking about deals that have implications for Hanoi's neighbor to the north, Beijing, which is not a signatory of TTIP, and which has growing territorial disputes with Vietnam in the resources-rich South China Sea. When the chips are down, how far will the U.S. go in backing Vietnam? And how much do Barack Obama's hosts really want to alienate their #1 trading partner to the north? Today in the France 24 debate, Obama in Vietnam. And joining us from Singapore, risk consultant Nguyen Van Linh. Welcome back to the France 24 debate.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And from Washington, we're joined by attorney Eric Schimpf. He's a former U.S. trade advisor. Welcome to the show.
Thanks. Pleasure to be here.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, #F24debate. It was once called Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City, where Barack Obama this Tuesday visited the Jade Pagoda, one of the city's oldest shrines. Earlier in the day in Hanoi, he defended Vietnam's sovereignty and territorial disputes with China, but also called on his hosts to loosen the leash when it comes to the freedom of expression of their own citizens.
As a friend of Vietnam, allow me to share my view. Why I believe nations are more successful when universal rights are upheld. When there's freedom of expression and freedom of speech, and when people can share ideas and access the internet and social media without restriction, that fuels the innovation economies need to thrive. That's where new ideas happen.
Nguyen Van Linh, we saw this similar sort of scenario when Barack Obama was in Cuba recently. He chastises his hosts on human rights, and then Obama goes away, and that's the end of it. Is it the same with Vietnam?
Well, I could say for the short term, yes, it likely appears to be the same in Cuba, where during past few days, 2 days, people in Vietnam basically forget about human rights issues. All they focus on is like a U.S. president is in the countries, and they gave him the warmest greetings, and thousands of people on the street waiting for him. And although I must say Obama's visit is not unprecedented, but it's a very important to Vietnamese people for symbolic reasons. But for the long term, I mean, the human rights problem is still there, and there's limited freedom of press, freedom of speech, and a bunch of other human rights issues in the country. So, I mean, one fix in a couple of days cannot solve our problem overnight. And yeah, for the long term, I think Vietnam still needs to work very hard on that. And as Barack Obama said in the joint statement, human rights and democracies are 2 areas that the both countries disagree on.
It's an interesting point because, and we heard the way, Eric Schimpf, which Barack Obama couched it, saying that human rights are good for innovation. Is that an argument that's going to fly?
Well, I think that's an argument that works over time, and that reflects sort of the longer plan or the longer strategy of the U.S. relationship with Vietnam. The discussion of human rights has been part of the diplomatic process between Washington and Hanoi since diplomatic relations were normalized back in 1994. So this is taking place over a generational time span. And I think that U.S. policy, as reflected in the president's comments, says that, first, we're not going to see any improvement over human rights if we at least don't have a dialogue with our partner country. And that second, economic liberalization itself is going to help free up human rights, and that it's easier to do so in the economic sphere. So I think that when we keep in mind that the president also met today in Ho Chi Minh with a number of of younger Vietnamese entrepreneurs and small business people that we see that he's making at least a symbolic linkage of those two.
But of course, we have the example to the north of China where the economy has opened up, but human rights have not come.
Well, I think not all human rights have come to China, but if you look at China today versus where China was 30 or 40 years ago in terms of at least individual economic freedoms, individual rights, you see a sea change to where the Chinese people have advanced in that area.
Barack Obama, as in Nguyen Phuong Linh, not the first U.S. president to visit Vietnam. In fact, he's the third. Monday night in Hanoi, the 44th president of the United States, wooing the crowds when he skipped banquet fare for some beer and bun cha, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, traditional pork noodles in the company of celebrity chef Anthony Bourdain. Price of the meal, the equivalent of $6 US. In Nguyen Phuong Linh, how's that going down with the Vietnamese?
Well, that's definitely win the love from all Vietnamese. I must say this is the most special visit from a country leader that I ever seen. And it's also the warmest welcome from Vietnamese people to a president or to a country leader that ever happened in Vietnam. And like for Vietnamese in the country, they never expect a politician or a president could like go on the street and having a normal meal with him.
In Nguyen Phuong Linh, I'm going to interrupt you because the connection seems to be worsening. We're going to try to fix that connection and get back to you. Let me ask you, Eric Shimp, about that. And also John Kerry, by the way, who got a Bronze Star when he fought in Vietnam. He also got a round of applause when he walked the streets of Hanoi for an interview with CBS, the moment captured on video by the Washington Post correspondent. Eric Shimp, your thoughts on the soft power that Obama and Kerry bring to Vietnam?
You know, I think that's a wonderful point to raise, and both President Obama's meeting with Vietnamese there in the streets, Secretary Kerry walking through Hanoi, those follow in the footsteps of a great tradition of American presidents and leaders being able to reach out directly to people when they visit countries. You have President Reagan talking to Russian students when he visited Moscow in the 80s. You have President Clinton doing much the same when he visited China and Hong Kong in the late 1990s. It really forges a strong connection that's almost personal with a leader who oftentimes can seem, far removed from the everyday.
And which brings us to the broader issue now of what's been agreed to, and most notably the lifting of this arms embargo. Eric Shimp, would you say that relations have now gone full circle with that?
I'm not sure I'd go quite that far. Vietnam remains not as good of a friend as, say, Japan, with whom we have a formal security alliance, or Australia or New Zealand or some of our other formal treaty allies that we have in Asia. But this is certainly a step in the right direction from the perspective of both capitals. The lifting of the arms embargo itself, it does not mean that Vietnam is suddenly free to shop through the U.S. arsenal, so to speak. All the sales to Vietnam will be subject both to U.S. export licenses on a case-by-case basis, plus they're going to be reviewed from a policy perspective in terms of, do the weapon systems or the technology that Vietnam is requesting make sense with respect to why Hanoi says they need them? Are they for maritime security? Are they for regional air defense? Or might they be used for internal policing uses with which the U.S. might not have a consistent policy view?
And Barack Obama restating his support for Vietnam's sovereignty. Of course, that's an allusion to the standoffs in the South China Sea that have been growing with China. How far will the United States go? We've seen the U.S. doing joint patrols with the Philippines. How far, if push comes to shove, if the Chinese and the Vietnamese really, there's a real escalation between the two, how far will the U.S. go in siding with Vietnam?
Well, that's, as we say, the $64 question, isn't it? I would point to my earlier comments again that Vietnam is not a formal treaty ally, so there is some ambiguity in there, and in that lies both an opportunity and a risk for the United States. And what the U.S. wants to do is strengthen its security partners in Asia so that they might better participate in a truly multilateral resolution of the South China Sea issue. But Washington wants to strengthen its allies, not to the point where they decide it's all right to take risks that would be out of keeping with U.S. interests, and that may prove to be a difficult line to walk. We're going to see quite possibly as early as next month if the arbitration tribunal that's ruling on the current South China Sea legal dispute between China and the Philippines makes a ruling that one or both parties are unhappy with. That will be the next significant test of how all parties in the region handle this rising conflict.
In Nguyen Phuong Linh, just how much is Vietnam banking on U.S. support in the future when it comes to China?
Well, I think from Vietnam perspective, the lifting the U.S. arms sales will first give Vietnam more options to reinforce its identities as a regional strategic partner rather than being kind of a proxies for the U.S. like many other Southeast Asia countries could want to be. And second, it could help Hanoi send a signal to Beijing that we have other options, which is important given the fact that China raising military powers in the region. And although the U.S. government said that the arms embargo lift is not because of China, but to be fair, China plays an important role in this game.
China plays an important role in the game, but you just heard Eric Schimpf saying that Vietnam, when it comes to allies, is not, for instance, the Philippines. So again, I ask you, Nguyen Phuong Linh, just how much will Vietnam count on the U.S. in the future?
Well, Vietnam government clearly say that they want to maintain the three no's policy: no alliance, no foreign base on Vietnamese soil, and no reliance on any nation to fight another nation. So Vietnam does not want to ally with the U.S. or any other countries against China. But on the other hand, Vietnam would like to see the U.S. to do heavy lifting to rebalance China's military power in the region.
China, which is not a signatory to that Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, for a country that calls itself the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, though, a single-party state run by communists, they sure love free trade. They've signed on. A recent Pew survey shows that the Vietnamese support 95% of them support the concept of free trade. Gosh, Eric Schimpf, when you think of the presidential election campaign that's taking place in the United States, did you ever think you'd see a day when the Vietnamese were more in favor of free trade than the Americans?
No, in fact, I wish we would see the Vietnamese numbers reflected in our national polls here, particularly if we want to see TPP ratified by the U.S. Congress anytime soon. But Vietnam does stand to be a major beneficiary of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Free Trade Agreement. They're going to see immediate gains in a lot of the goods that they export, not only to the U.S., but throughout the region: textiles, apparel, footwear, various manufactured goods. The investment that's going to come out of the agreement should allow Vietnamese industries to move further up the value chain. From a Western perspective, all these things are combined with the positives that Vietnam has signed on to in terms of internal reforms, greater labor rights, more competitive wages and good working conditions for laborers, as well as reform of Vietnam's own vast state-owned enterprise structure. So through that, you'll see the Vietnamese economy becoming more competitive if we can get this agreement past the Congress.
Past the Congress and past perhaps the next president of the United States, since all of the candidates have expressed skepticism. If the winds of change are turning against an agreement that's been signed here, what's going to happen for that Asia pivot by the United States?
Well, if you're not involved economically in Asia, you will not be involved in any meaningful way politically in Asia. And certainly, national security officials from both sides of the partisan divide here in Washington and from multiple past generations see that connection very clearly and are urging the passage of TPP. It's not clear at all that that's going to be enough right now. What it may take, quite frankly, for the TPP to eventually get ratified is for the competing agreement in which China and India and all of the ASEAN 10 nations are playing a role, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or the RCEP, for that to be completed and implemented, and for U.S. and other North American companies from Canada and Mexico to lose substantial market share in Asia as a result of the RCEP coming into being, while the Trans-Pacific Partnership is left on the shelf.
I was going to ask you, so just how much is the TPP directed against China, since they're not signatories?
I don't think it's directed against China in an overt or direct way. I think the RCEP and the TPP are competing visions for how trade agreements should be constructed. The TPP includes disciplines, like I indicated, on Vietnam's perspective, on labor, on reform of state-owned enterprises, and on limiting the monopoly or the anti-competitive power of state-funded enterprises, stronger protections for intellectual property, disciplines on trade facilitation, the ability to make a trade agreement recognize how a global supply chain actually works. So there are a lot of rules and standard-setting exercises achieved by the TPP, frankly, that favor the advanced economies like Japan, the U.S., Canada, et cetera, that are lacking in the RCEP. And if you're writing the rules of trade, you want, from the U.S. perspective, you want a very high standard because that's where your companies are the most competitive.
And this is going to be on the agenda as Barack Obama continues his tour of Asia. Many thanks, Eric Schimp, for joining us from Washington. I want to thank Nguyen Phong Linh for being with us from Singapore. Stay with us when we come back, part 2 of the France 24 debate. And the left in France tearing itself apart over a labor reform bill. Now it's oil refineries that have been shut down. We'll be talking about it when we come back.